I've been wanting to make these type of scrunchies for a while. Just a disclaimer, this isn't necessarily a tutorial. I record these projects as a way of taking notes that hopefully I can and will use for future projects. They might be helpful, they might not be. I also just like watching my sewing sped up. The scrunchies in question are often referred to as ruffled scrunchies. They differ from the regular old scrunchies because instead of a single tube of fabric encasing elastic, they're made by threading the elastic through a narrow channel, which causes the scrunchie to ruffle up. I love the ones from Miriam Nazir Zadeh that are made from silk ribbons. They look great when worn as a proper scrunchie or as an accessory on your arm or even your ankle. Good Squish is a fairly new but very popular small company that makes a lot of these ruffled scrunchies. They have ones that use massive pieces of fabric. They also use the ribbon construction seen on M&Z, but what sets them apart is the variety of fabrics that they use. Many times they're making these ribbons by layering on different types of sewing notions, and they're really fun to wear and look at. The construction of the scrunchie is very simple. You can change the look and feel of the scrunchies a lot by changing the fabric. You can make the scrunchie with a single panel of fabric, but I like using at least 2 layers. You can actually use more layers to add even more drama. Each panel of fabric is sewn together to create a loop. Next, a channel is sewn. If you're using 2 or more panels, you layer the loops together and sew 2 straight stitches to create the channel for the elastic. If you were using just a single panel of fabric, you would fold the loop once and sew a single straight stitch parallel to the closed edge of the folded loop. After you thread the elastic through this channel, you will get a characteristic ruffling of the fabric. As I said, you can dramatically change the look of the resulting scrunchie by changing your fabric and changing the size of your fabric panel. I like the result from using different fabrics, or at least different textures of that fabric. So the scrunchie that I'm making will be made from the same fabric, which is a neon double silk georgette, but I'm using different textures by using a smooth ribbon along with box pleated ribbons. I made these ribbons myself from leftover fabric from an alteration project that I hope to finish soon. I've included the techniques I used to make the ribbons at the very end of the video. For my scrunchie, I need 2 smooth ribbons and 4 pleated ribbons. The smooth ribbon will sit between 2 pleated ribbons. Usually a scrunchie or hair tie that sits at my wrists can go around my hair twice, so I'm roughly measuring out how much elastic I'm using. I'm making it a little bit looser around my wrist. Here I'm using braided elastic. I'm going to secure these ends later by sewing about 1 inch of the elastic overlapped. In any case, that means the circumference of the tie will be 7.5 inches. The length of the fabric used to make the elastic will be longer. I'm using double the length of the elastic, so that's 15 inches. Hopefully that gives me sufficient ruffling to create the look I want. To create a pleated ribbon that's 15 inches long, I actually need 3 times the length because the pleating effectively creates 3 layers of the fabric along the length. So I need 4 ribbons that are about 45 inches long to box pleat. My scrap fabric isn't that long, but it ended up working out because my ribbons weren't pleated perfectly. The first thing I did was attach the 2 pleated ribbons to the smooth ribbon. I just placed the smooth piece over the raw edge of the pleated ribbon. I'm covering up about 1/4 inch of the pleated ribbon. I'm sewing over the hem stitch at the very edge of the smooth ribbon. You'll see in this clip that I'm struggling here when I place the foot at the start of the ribbons. You'll also see that I used tissue paper to help stabilize the fabric. I didn't change any settings on the machine. The only thing I did was switch out the needle to a microtex needle. That's a super pointy needle suited for sewing silks. Eventually what I did was simply move the pleated ribbon further down and started sewing further down the smooth ribbon. The smooth ribbon was longer than the pleated ribbon, so that was fine. The next step is to fold the ribbon along the length with right sides folded together. I measured about 15 inches long on both of the panels and used a small piece of thread to mark the beginning and end of the 15 inches. I'm using them as guides to match the ends of the fabric. This is where I will sew the seam. On this loop, I will make 2 stitches to leave a hole in the center where I will thread in the elastic. The other loop will be completely closed. The hole I made on this one ended up being a little bit too small, but I worked with it. The seam allowance here will be exposed when you're done with the scrunchie. The ribbons were a little bit challenging to work with because of the fabric and the pleats. I should have ironed the fabric as flat as possible at the seam. I ended up rolling up the raw edges of the seam allowance toward the seam and hand stitching them in place. I'm using some muslin fabric here to demonstrate how to cleanly finish the seam. I'm using a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. After creating that seam, you want to press that seam open either with an iron or with your fingers if the fabric allows for it. Fold the corners of the seam allowance behind the pressed seam. Then fold the seam allowance in half, once again behind the seam allowance. Press this folded seam allowance flat against the fabric. Depending on your fabric, you might consider base stitching before taking it to the machine. Sew a straight stitch near the edge of this fold. Repeat with the other side of the seam. Now I have 2 loops of fabric, one completely closed on the seam, the other has an opening right in the center. I'm going to place them together with wrong sides touching, with the loop with the hole on the inside. It doesn't really matter what you choose because you can flip this in the end, but because my ribbons are kind of uneven, I wanted at least one side to look very neat. If your ribbons have nice finished edges, you don't have to do what I do next, which is stitch the 2 loops together along the edge of the smooth ribbon to encase all the raw edges inside. I base stitched the 2 loops together before taking this to the machine. You'll see I sewed right along the edge of the smooth ribbon. The ribbons I made, like I said, weren't exactly the same width, so when I checked the stitch on the other side, they were clearly not at the edge of the ribbon on that side. When I was removing the basting stitch, I realized I had sewn some of the pleats onto the smooth ribbon, so I unfortunately had to pick apart the stitches there and go back over it. If you're working with this type of fabric, just be really careful, work slowly, and constantly check that the fabric isn't getting under the presser foot when it's not supposed to. It's really easy to damage this type of delicate fabric just pulling apart stitches. I could thread the elastic through the scrunchie at this point since I technically have a channel, but I don't want the elastic to move around that much, so I'm going to sew 2 additional straight stitches around the loop that's just a little bit wider than the elastic. Like I said, if you're using materials that are already cleanly finished, you don't have to do the first set of stitches that I did to enclose the raw edges. You would secure the 2 loops with stitching here to create the channel for the elastic. Here I go all around the loop again and again. In this poorly filmed clip, I thread the elastic through the channel by attaching a safety pin to one end of the elastic, and I use that safety pin to pull the elastic through. Once I can grab both ends of the elastic, I pushed as much of the fabric away from these ends as possible to make sewing them together easier. I overlapped the ends by about 1 inch, did some hand stitches to help keep the ends in place, and then used a wide and short zigzag stitch to sew along the length of that overlap. I turned the elastic around when I reached the end of that overlap and then used a more narrow stitch to go back over the overlap. I repeated this a third time with an even more narrow stitch. I started with 7mm, reduced that to 5mm, and then finally 3mm on the third pass. This part ended up still stretchy, but it's a little bit stiff, so you want to minimize this type of closure. In the future, I'm just going to go over the overlap twice with the machine and reduce the overlap to 1/2 inch. This still would have been really secure. After that, I just need to get the closed part of the elastic all the way into the scrunchie. If you gently stretch your scrunchie as much as possible, that should help get it all in. And you're done. Isn't that so pretty? It looks like a flower to me. I love the way neons really do fluoresce and glow when light lands on them. This just looks so nice, don't you think? The last 2 segments just has clips of me making the ribbons. I cut these with the rotary cutter because it's nearly impossible to cut this type of fabric neatly with scissors. I cut the ribbons about 1.5 inches wide. I was actually supposed to cut the pleated ribbons 1.75 inches wide, but I wasn't looking at the ruler correctly. So my scrunchie ended up being a little bit more narrow than I had originally planned. Anyways, to finish the edges of the ribbon, I used the ban-rol method to create a super narrow rolled hem. With this method, you need ban-rol, which is a stiff woven material that provides structure to a waistband. I'm linking the videos I watched to learn about this technique. You basically pull apart the lengthwise woven threads of the ban-rol on one side to expose effectively a narrow comb that you sew the fabric to. I'm just going to refer to that part that doesn't have the lengthwise threads, a comb. Once you secure the fabric to the ban-rol, you flip the ban-rol over the fabric or the fabric over the ban-rol, however you see it, and sew the comb again on the other side. At the end, you should be able to pull this comb edge away from the fabric because it's opened on that one edge where you had removed the threads. I originally only pulled 2 threads out. This was very narrow and hard to work with. I had to work slowly to ensure that I was sewing on the comb and not on the part of the ban-rol that was still woven. I pulled another thread and I felt that was easier to work with and gave a cleaner looking result. You'll see this clearly in the ribbon that has 2 rolled hems. The top hem on the screen was sewn with 2 threads pulled out and the bottom hem with 3 threads pulled out. My tip is to make sure that you are sewing down the center of that comb, and when you're sewing on the other side, try to sew closer to the edge on the inner part of the ribbon while still keeping away from the woven part of the ban-rol. I also found it much easier to work with a ban-rol that was more narrow than my ribbon. I also box pleated 4 of the ribbons as I mentioned earlier. I followed a tutorial that had me cut out a little tool to fold the fabric as I was sewing. I wanted my box pleats to be 3/4 of an inch wide, so I made the tulle 3/8 of an inch wide. Using tissue paper really helped to stabilize the fabric and prevent the machine from eating it. Of course, you can avoid doing all this work by just buying notions that are ready to use. I've listed a few in the description box. I can't personally vouch for them since I haven't used them, but I was eyeing them. Just don't try to use those really cheap ribbons that are meant for wrapping up presents.